You were not made for the chaos of this world. You were not made to be a machine in a system that runs you 7 days a week until your spirit collapses. No, you were made in the image of God, the God who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. And on the seventh, he rested, not because he was tired, but because he was setting a pattern, a divine rhythm, a holy reminder. He blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And when he did that, he carved something eternal into the flow of time. A signature, a seal, a sign between him and his people. The Sabbath is not just a day off. It's a day to remember who you are. Because in this world, you will forget. Life will try to rename you. Culture will try to redefine you. Trauma will try to silence you. But every seventh day, the voice of God breaks through the noise and says, remember who you are. Remember who I am. Remember that you were not made to be a slave to Pharaoh, or Babylon, or Wall Street, or social media, or the opinions of others. You were made to rest in me. The Sabbath is the reset that reconnects you to your true name. It reminds you that you are not just a body, you are a soul. You are not just surviving, you are chosen. You are not just a number, you are a child of the Most High. The Sabbath is a mirror, and when you keep it, you don't just see a calendar change. You see yourself differently. You begin to walk differently. You begin to remember that you were made for more than this world's grind and greed. You were made for glory. The Sabbath reclaims your dignity, because it takes your identity out of man's hands and puts it back in God's. And oh, how the enemy hates that. He hates the Sabbath. Not because it's just a day, but because of what it does to you. It reminds you of your Creator. It reminds you that you are not the property of the system. It reminds you that you belong to God. That's why they changed it. That's why they tried to erase it. Because if you forget the Sabbath, you forget the Creator. If you forget the Creator, you forget your identity. And if you forget your identity, the enemy can name you anything he wants. But the moment you return to the Sabbath, the moment you honor that seventh day, you're taking back your power. You're stepping out of slavery and into sonship. You're rejecting the counterfeit and returning to the covenant. The Sabbath is not just a commandment, it's a love letter. It's God saying, I still want you. I still choose you. I still want time with you. And when you respond to that invitation, something shifts in the spirit. You begin to remember that you were not called to blend in, but to stand apart. You begin to remember that you are part of a remnant, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. The Sabbath reveals that you are different, not because you're better, but because you're chosen to be a light in a world that has lost its way. And to those whose ancestors were stripped of their name, their language, their land, and their God, the Sabbath is a call back home. It is a return to the ancient path, to the truth that was buried but never broken. It is the voice of Yah calling his people back to covenant, back to identity, back to himself. You are not lost, you are being found. And every Sabbath that you keep is a declaration that the lies of history will not define your future. So I declare to you today, walk in your identity, embrace the gift. Don't let convenience rob you of covenant. Don't let tradition silence truth. Don't let man-made religion override God-ordained rest. You were made for more. You were made for Him. And when you honor the Sabbath, you don't just keep a day. You reclaim your name. You remember who you are. You remember whose you are. You were not made for Pharaoh's clothes. You were made for the King's presence. You were made to rest, to rejoice, to remember. The Sabbath is a sign. The Sabbath is a seal. The Sabbath is a mirror that shows you what the world tried to hide, your true identity. The Sabbath is God's signature on His people. It is not merely a rest or a religious tradition. It is a divine mark, a spiritual seal that identifies who belongs to the Most High. In Ezekiel 20:12, God declares, "Moreover also I gave them my Sabbath, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them." This is not poetic language. It is covenant language. The Sabbath is not man-made. It is God-given. It did not begin with Moses. It began with creation. Before there was a temple, before there was a law written on stone, there was the Sabbath. On the seventh day, after creating the heavens and the earth, God himself rested, not because he was tired, but because he was establishing a rhythm, a revelation, and a relationship. When God set apart the seventh day and sanctified it, he stamped it with holiness. He blessed that day and made it sacred, not just for rest, but for remembrance. The Sabbath reminds us who we are, by reminding us who he is. It declares to every soul that we are not random beings, floating through time, surviving on our own. No, we are created, we are chosen, we are his. And the Sabbath is the sign that we belong to a God who finishes what he starts, who creates with intention, and who enters into relationship with his people. It is his signature, written not with ink, but with sacred time. Every week that seventh day returns like a handwritten letter from God, saying, "You are mine." The Sabbath reveals identity in a world that tries to rename and redefine us. The world says you are what you do, what you earn, what you produce. But the Sabbath says you are more than your labor. You are more than your performance. You are more than your paycheck. You are a son. You are a daughter. You are beloved of God. In ancient Israel, the Sabbath wasn't just a day of rest. It was a state. It was a weekly act of resistance against the systems of slavery, the idols of productivity, and the culture of busyness. It was a declaration that Yahweh, not Pharaoh, was their master. And today, in a world that still runs people into the ground, the Sabbath still speaks. It still tells the truth about who you are. It says your worth is not measured in output. It's measured by the one who called you. This is why the Sabbath is more than law. It's love. God didn't give us the Sabbath to burden us. He gave it to bless us. It is a gift that says you don't have to strive to be mine. You already are. And when you honor the Sabbath, you are doing more than keeping a commandment. You are receiving a calling. You are stepping into sacred identity. You are acknowledging that the one who created time also created you, and he marked you for himself. Just as a king seals his letters with a royal insignia, God seals his people with his Sabbath. It is his weekly signature over your life, a visible, lived-out testimony that you belong to him. And oh, how the enemy hates that signature. He has tried to erase it from calendars, from doctrine, from culture, because he knows what it represents. He knows it's the sign of allegiance, the mark of distinction, the banner of holiness. But no matter how far the world drifts, no matter how much religion compromises, God's Sabbath remains. It still calls out, still invites, still seals those who will hear and obey. When you return to the Sabbath, you are not just observing a day, you are reclaiming an identity. You are saying with your life, I know who I am, I know whose I am, and that is the power of the Sabbath. It is God's signature, his holy mark that you are his forever. The Sabbath disconnects you from the system of slavery. It is more than a day of rest. It is a spiritual declaration of freedom. When God gave the Sabbath to his people, he wasn't just giving them a break. He was giving them back their identity. In Deuteronomy 5:15, he reminded them, and remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a break from bondage. It was a weekly interruption of oppression. It was a divine disruption to a system that had once worked God's people into the ground, stripped them of their value, and reduced them to tools of production. In Egypt, there was no rest, no pause, no Sabbath. There was only endless work, constant pressure, and soul-crushing labor. Pharaoh didn't care about their well-being. He only cared about bricks, numbers, and control. That same spirit still lives today. It wears different clothes. Corporate systems, consumerism, 24/7 hustle culture. But its mission remains the same. Keep you busy, keep you distracted, keep you tired, and keep you disconnected from God. But the Sabbath cuts through that system. The Sabbath breaks the chain. It tells Pharaoh, no more. It says to the taskmaster, I don't belong to you. Every time you honor the Sabbath, you're making a spiritual protest against everything in this world that tries to enslave your mind, your time, and your soul. The Sabbath reclaims what slavery tried to erase. It restores dignity. It reminds you that you are not a machine made for output, but a creation made for communion. You were not made to burn out. You were made to abide. The Sabbath is a holy resistance against the lie that says your worth is found in your work. It is God saying you don't have to earn rest. I've already given it to you. And it is a direct assault on the spirit of Pharaoh, who still whispers, do more, be more, prove more. But God whispers back, be still and know that I am God. That whisper becomes a roar every seventh day. When you stop everything and remember that your identity is not in your labor, it's in your liberation. For those whose ancestors were literally enslaved, the Sabbath takes on an even deeper meaning. It becomes not just spiritual, but generational. It becomes an act of restoration, a return to what was stolen. The Sabbath says to the children of those who were chained, whipped, and worked without mercy, you are no longer a slave, you are free. And this day is your reminder. It is a holy rhythm that breaks every generational curse of labor without love, effort without rest, and survival without peace. God gave the Sabbath to a people who had forgotten what freedom felt like, and through it he taught them how to live again, not as slaves but as sons and daughters. This world will never voluntarily give you rest. It will never tell you to pause. But the Sabbath doesn't ask the world for permission. It stands in defiance of the grind. It refuses to bow to busyness. It pulls you out of the current of chaos and places you in the peace of God. And every time you keep it, you are reminding yourself in the world of something powerful. You are not owned by your job, your schedule, or your status. You are owned by God. The Sabbath disconnects you from the slavery of the system and reconnects you to the freedom of the Spirit. It is not just a rest day, it is a revolution. The Sabbath restores what the world tried to erase. In a world that constantly tells you who you are, based on your job, your income, your appearance, or your status, the Sabbath is a sacred act of remembering the truth. It speaks to the parts of your soul that have been worn down, silenced, or redefined by the expectations of a society that has lost sight of the Creator. The Sabbath reaches into your core identity and begins the process of restoration, restoring dignity, restoring purpose, and restoring your divine connection. We live in a time where people are taught to forget who they are. From the moment we're born, we're given labels, roles, and narratives that may have nothing to do with God's original plan. History has been rewritten, heritage has been distorted, and culture has been shaped to disconnect us from our spiritual root. Many don't even know where they come from, who they belong to, or why they were created. The world has tried to erase the truth of your origin, your worth, and your divine destiny. But every seventh day, the Sabbath brings it all back. The Sabbath is not just about ceasing from labor. It's about entering into truth. It is God's appointed time to recalibrate your identity. It tells you that you were made in the image of God, not in the image of society's expectation. It reminds you that before the world labeled you, God named you. Before you were ever called employee, consumer, or statistic, you were called beloved, chosen, and holy. The Sabbath peels away the layers of deception that the world has placed over your soul. It interrupts the lies, it confronts the false narratives, and it declares, this is who you really are. For people whose history has been buried, those whose ancestors were stolen, sold, and stripped of name and culture, the Sabbath is a healing balm. It's not just a spiritual discipline, it's a divine recovery of identity. It speaks to the descendants of the oppressed, the marginalized, and the displaced, and says you are not forgotten. Your God still remembers you, and this day is your inheritance. The Sabbath restores what colonization tried to erase. It breathes life back into a people who were told they had none. It reconnects the scattered to their source. In a world where erasure has been the norm, the Sabbath is God's way of saying, I remember you, I see you, and I call you mine. This restoration is not only personal, it's prophetic. The Sabbath is a taste of Eden, a reminder of what was, and a preview of what will be. When you enter into Sabbath rest, you're not just stopping work, you're stepping into divine alignment. You're being reintroduced to yourself through God's eyes. You're reclaiming your time, your soul, and your story. And through that act of restoration, you begin to live from a place of wholeness. You no longer function from brokenness, from burnout, or from borrowed identity. You begin to walk in the truth of who you were always meant to be. The world tries to erase God from culture, from law, from memory, and in doing so it tries to erase the people of God too. But the Sabbath is like a holy archive, a sacred record that cannot be destroyed. It's a weekly memorial that withstands the winds of time and the corruption of human systems. Every time you keep the Sabbath, you're participating in God's restoration project. You're saying, I remember what the world forgot. You're declaring, I'm connected to something deeper, older, and holier than what this world has to offer. So when you rest, it's more than relaxation, it's restoration. When you worship, it's more than routine, it's realignment. And when you honor the Sabbath, it's more than obedience, it's identity. It restores what the world tried to erase. It brings you back to who you are in God. The Sabbath is a weekly return to covenant. It is not just a pause in the week. It is a divine appointment, a sacred invitation to step back into alignment with the heart of God. From the beginning, God has always been a covenant-keeping God. He doesn't form relationships casually. He binds himself in promises, in love, in sacred agreement. And when he gave the Sabbath, he gave more than a law. He gave a symbol of that covenant. In Exodus 31:16, it is written, Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for a perpetual covenant. This is not a temporary instruction or a cultural tradition. This is a holy rhythm of returning to relationship. Every seventh day, the Sabbath calls us back to the one who created us, back to the truths we forget in the noise of daily life, back to the identity that gets buried under schedules, deadlines, and distraction. The world is constantly pulling us away from God, away from stillness, away from holiness, away from the awareness that we are not our own. But the Sabbath reaches into that chaos and draws us into peace. It resets the soul. It recenters the heart. It reminds us that we are in covenant with the Most High God, and that relationship demands our time, our attention, and our obedience. When God's people keep the Sabbath, they are not just observing a day, they are renewing a vow. They are saying, I still belong to you. They are returning to sacred ground, returning to the embrace of the Creator. Just like a wedding ring is a sign of marital covenant, the Sabbath is a sign of our spiritual covenant. It marks us as God's people. It's a public and personal declaration that we are set apart, that we live by a different rhythm, and that our lives are under divine order. In keeping the Sabbath, we acknowledge that He is our God, and we are His people. The covenant is not built on convenience. It is built on commitment. And commitment means returning, even when the world pulls us away. It means stopping when the culture says keep going. It means saying no to the demands of Pharaoh, and yes to the call of God. The Sabbath is countercultural because covenant is countercultural. In a world of contracts, God offers covenant, a relationship rooted in love, loyalty, and trust. And He asks us to return to it every 7 days, to sit with Him, to listen again, to worship in truth, and to rest in the shadow of His wing. This return to covenant is not burdensome. It is beautiful. It is not about rules. It is about relationship. God doesn't ask us to keep the Sabbath because He needs the time. He asks because He knows we do. He knows we need to be reminded of who He is and who we are. We need the regular rhythm of reconnection, of realignment, of renewal. The Sabbath is the gift that keeps us grounded in grace and rooted in purpose. It is the holy echo of God's voice saying, "Come back to me. Let us walk together." In returning to covenant each Sabbath, we also prepare for the final fulfillment of all things. The Sabbath on earth is a shadow of the eternal rest to come. It is a rehearsal for heaven, a prophetic glimpse of the restoration of all things. As we honor the covenant now, we align ourselves with the kingdom that is coming. The Sabbath becomes a testimony, not just to our faithfulness, but to God's. Because every time we return, we find that He is still there, still waiting, still faithful to the covenant He made. So when the Sabbath arrives, it is not just another weekend, it is a divine call to remember, to return, and to rejoice in the covenant love of a holy God. It is our weekly altar, our sanctuary, in time, where we say with our lives, we are still yours. The Sabbath reveals that you are not what you do. In a world that measures people by productivity, achievement, and status, the Sabbath stands as a divine interruption. It tears down the illusion that your worth is tied to your performance. It speaks truth in a culture obsessed with hustle and grind. 6 days a week, the world tries to convince you that you are defined by your job title, your resume, your reputation, or your income. But then comes the seventh day, holy, set apart, untouched by the noise of society, and it whispers a different truth. You are not what you do, you are who God says you are. From the beginning, God wove this truth into creation. In Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh, He rested, not because He was weary, but because He was complete. And in doing so, He established a rhythm for His creation. Work has its place, but it does not define our essence. God didn't bless the first 6 days. He blessed the seventh. He sanctified it. He set it apart as a reminder that identity comes from Him, not from effort. The Sabbath is God's way of saying, you don't have to keep proving yourself. You don't have to keep chasing approval. You are already mine. It's not a day to fall behind. It's a day to rise above the lies of the world. It's the day when the soul breathes again, free from the chains of performance. When you honor the Sabbath, you are actively stepping away from the noise and saying, I trust God enough to rest. That rest is not weakness, it's worship. It's faith in action. It is a declaration that your value is fixed, secure, and rooted in divine truth. The world may call you lazy for pausing. It may mock the idea of rest, but heaven calls it obedience. The Sabbath is not just a break from doing, it's a return to being. It realigns you with the truth that you are a child of God before you are anything else. Before you were an employee, a leader, a creator, or a provider, you were loved. And that love has nothing to do with what you can produce. The Sabbath teaches us to stop, to listen, and to remember who we were before the world gave us a name based on performance. This truth is especially healing for those who have been broken by burnout, crushed under the weight of expectations, or trapped in cycles of trying to earn love and approval. The Sabbath doesn't require you to show up with accomplishments. It invites you to show up just as you are. No masks, no metrics, just you and God. It is the one day where rest becomes resistance. Resistance against a system that constantly demands more, but never satisfies. In Sabbath rest, you rediscover the peace of simply being without needing to impress or earn anything. Jesus echoed this reality when He said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. It was made for your good. It was designed to restore what the world depletes. It was given to protect you from the lie that says you are only as valuable as your last success. On the Sabbath, your soul can remember that even in stillness, you are seen. Even in silence, you are significant. Even when you're not working, you are worthy. So when the Sabbath comes, don't resist it. Receive it. Let it wash away the lies. Let it speak to your identity. Let it remind you that your value is not earned, but given. You are not what you do. You are who God made you to be. And every seventh day, heaven testifies to that truth. The Sabbath is a prophetic identity marker in the end time. It is far more than a day of rest or religious tradition. It is a divine sign that reveals who belongs to God in the last day. As we approach a world filled with confusion, deception, and spiritual conflict, the Sabbath stands as a clear boundary, a marker that distinguishes God's faithful people from the crowd. Throughout Scripture, the Sabbath is not only a commandment, but a symbol of allegiance, a sign that says, I belong to the Creator. In the prophetic context, it becomes a powerful testimony against the forces that seek to blur the line between truth and error, light and darkness. In the book of Revelation, we see a stark warning about the mark of the beast, a symbol of loyalty to worldly powers opposed to God. In contrast, the Sabbath serves as God's seal, His sign of ownership on His people. It is a weekly reminder that faithfulness is not just about belief, but about practice, about living according to God's revealed truth. When the world pressures us to conform, to compromise, or to worship on other days, the Sabbath calls us back to a higher standard. It boldly declares that we recognize God's authority over time itself, that we honor His order and His covenant. This is no small thing in the spiritual battle raging in the end time. The Sabbath as a prophetic identity marker means that it reveals not just who we are now, but who we will be in eternity. It is a symbol of hope, a sign that God's people remain faithful even when the world rejects them. It calls for courage and conviction in the face of opposition, reminding believers that their true citizenship is in heaven, not in earthly systems. The Sabbath is the weekly rehearsal for that eternal rest promised to the faithful, a rest that transcends physical relief and points to a complete restoration of all things. Because the Sabbath is tied to God's creative authority, observing it in the end times becomes a radical act of worship and witness. It says, I stand with the God who made the heavens and the earth, who controls time and who is sovereign over all. In a world where many reject divine authority and seek to establish their own systems of control, the Sabbath keeps believers grounded in God's kingdom. It is a tangible way to resist cultural pressure, commercial exploitation, and spiritual deception. Observing the Sabbath is not just a private act of devotion. It is a prophetic stance that aligns us with God's eternal plan. The significance of the Sabbath in the end times also speaks to community and unity. It is a sign that God's people gather, not just as individuals, but as a covenant community united in faith and obedience. The Sabbath binds believers together across time and space, reminding us that we are part of a larger story, a story that began at creation and will culminate in glory. In the midst of chaos and uncertainty, the Sabbath is an anchor that holds us firm. It is a sacred time when God's people pause, worship, and reaffirm their loyalty to Him. Moreover, the Sabbath's prophetic role challenges believers to live counterculturally, to choose God's rhythms over the world's demands. It calls for intentionality in how we manage our time, prioritize rest, and cultivate spiritual renewal. The world's systems often push for non-stop work, endless consumption, and distraction, but the Sabbath says no to that. It invites us into a different way of life, one marked by trust, surrender, and dependence on God. In doing so, it reveals the true identity of God's people, those who do not conform to the patterns of the world, but are transformed by the renewing of their minds. Ultimately, the Sabbath as a prophetic identity marker points forward to the final victory of God's kingdom. It is a sign that God's people remain faithful amid trials and tribulations, that they honor His commandments even when pressured to do otherwise, and that they await the day when God's rest will be fully realized. Observing the Sabbath is an act of hope, a declaration that no matter what happens, God's promises stand firm. It says, I belong to the God of creation, covenant, and eternal rest. And in the end times, that declaration is a powerful testimony to the world. So the Sabbath is not just about rest or ritual. It is a prophetic identity marker. It is God's sign on His people, a weekly reminder of who we are and whose we are. It prepares us for the challenges ahead, anchors us in God's truth, and points us forward to the eternal rest that awaits. In the final days, keeping the Sabbath is a bold proclamation. We are God's, and we will stand firm in Him until the end. The Sabbath reveals whose image you reflect. In a world filled with confusion about identity and value, the Sabbath stands as a divine mirror, reflecting the image of the Creator in whom we were made. It is more than a day of rest. It is a sacred reminder that beneath all the external labels and worldly definitions, your true identity is found in God's likeness. When you keep the Sabbath, you are not just honoring a commandment, you are proclaiming the truth about who you are and whose you are. From the beginning of creation, God made humanity in His own image. This was not a casual detail. It was the foundation of our identity and purpose. To be made in the image of God means to carry His attributes: creativity, love, justice, mercy, and holiness. But the pressures of life, the brokenness of the world, and the demands of society often cloud that reflection. We begin to see ourselves through the lens of what we do, what we own, or how others perceive us. The Sabbath is God's answer to that distortion. It calls us to pause, to look deeper, and to remember that our true image is divine. On the Sabbath, the world's noise fades, and the divine image shines through. When you cease from labor and enter into rest, you participate in the very nature of God, who rested on the seventh day. This rest is not laziness or inactivity. It is a holy act that reflects God's character. It reveals that God values balance, restoration, and peace. Keeping the Sabbath is an acknowledgement that you are made to reflect these qualities, that your identity is not rooted in endless work or worldly success, but in the sacred rhythm of creation. The Sabbath also reveals the image you reflect by reconnecting you to the Creator's original design. In a society that often distorts identity through competition, comparison, and achievement, the Sabbath resets your perspective. It invites you to step back from striving and to rest in the truth that you are created in God's image, fully valued and deeply loved. This weekly return to rest is a spiritual recalibration that restores the reflection of God in your life. It cleans the mirror of your soul so that you can see yourself as God sees you. Moreover, the Sabbath reveals your image by shaping how you relate to others. Because you reflect the image of a relational God, Sabbath rest fosters relationships, both with God and with your community. It's a time to come together in worship, in fellowship, and in shared peace. When you keep the Sabbath, you declare that you are part of a family made in God's likeness, called to live out His love and justice in the world. This communal aspect of the Sabbath underscores that the divine image is not just personal. It is expressed through how we live and love others. The Sabbath also challenges the false images that the world promotes, images of power, greed, selfishness, and control. By honoring the Sabbath, you reject those counterfeit identities and embrace the true image of God. You demonstrate that your worth is not determined by domination or exploitation, but by holiness and grace. The Sabbath becomes a testimony, a living witness that God's image is alive and active in you. In keeping the Sabbath, you join a timeless community of believers who have stood firm in their identity, despite trials and cultural pressures. From the earliest followers of God to those today who choose to honor the Sabbath, this practice has been a beacon of identity, and it says to the world, "I reflect the Creator. I am made in His image." This declaration is powerful, especially in a world that tries to erase or redefine true identity. Ultimately, the Sabbath reveals that you reflect the image of a God who loves rest, renewal, and relationship. It calls you to embody those qualities and to live as a reflection of His glory on earth. When you honor the Sabbath, you reclaim your divine identity and stand as a testament to the world that you are God's creation, designed in His likeness, and called to reflect His character in all you do. The Sabbath is not just a day. It is a mirror reflecting the sacred truth of who you are, a beloved child made in the image of the Creator.